Okay, so understanding and achieving ADHD, and this is week 9, the second to final week, and emotional resilience. So we'll be getting into many of the things that we've talked a little bit about in the past, but we'll get into it in more detail regarding the kind of core beliefs that might distort our view of the world and therefore impact the way that we interact with the world. So I'll first talk about the elephant in the rider, which of course is a metaphor. And basically, this is the idea that our emotional side can be considered like the elephant, that it runs the show in large part. And then the rider, our conscious mind, is able to make small corrections. And this is the case with everybody. If the elephant is very, very directive in which way it's going, if we have a very high emotional drive in a particular situation, then we will have limited ability to direct which way we're going, what actions we take, and what we're thinking about. Then we'll talk about the wise mind approach, where we factor in both kind of our emotional intuition and what we think on a rational level. We'll talk about failure, which we've talked about a bit about a few weeks ago, insights and solutions regarding that. Then get into people pleasing, which we've touched on before. Then unrelenting standards, rejection, and insights and solutions regarding that. And then therapy options to help you decrease disproportional emotional reactions if they happen to be going on and difficult to sort out on your own. Within relationships, if we feel angry about something, which is to say that we feel that something is unfair, and it seems to be like it's not just a one-time case or something like that, like it seems to be going on, it is important to address that in some way, not necessarily when we're feeling that anger, but if we don't find some way of bringing it up in a useful way to find some compromise or whatever it is, then we will end up showing that in ways that we might not want to. Like it can come out in an uncontrolled kind of way. I used to work a lot with kids and their parents. That's something very often, if I was brought a child who was quite a handful at home, I would very often see that their parents were kind of like, yeah, well, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be this angry person who's, doing this and that. Basically, their ideas of not being a disciplinarian. But when they don't do that, then they will end up putting themselves in situations that they can't be in continually and still be the person they want to be. Like if they're like, okay, so I don't want to be the bad guy and tell my child not to do X, Y, or Z, and then they do that all the time, it's kind of like this bet on themselves that they're like, I can take that and not be the person I don't want to be, which is almost never true. If we allow that kind of constant just like things are very hard on an ongoing basis, right? Then we will end up snapping, we will end up getting angry when we don't want to and stuff like that, and actually being, in that case, parents that we don't want to be. But the same goes with any of our friends or loved ones. And so like we were mostly talking last week about like how anger can present in ways that are not helpful and how we can, recognize those and circumvent those. But there are also situations where we can rationally recognize that like, yeah, I probably should have done something here. And in those situations, then it is best for us to do that, for us to have like an open communication where we can let those things kind of come. Oftentimes in relationships, people will like, they don't want to seem like they're overly sensitive or something like that. So they might want to kind of downplay how they're feeling about something. But if that means not mentioning it all, then ultimately the relationship may have less of a chance, in some cases where people just aren't like, they will allow something that over time leads to resentment instead of, putting it forward and saying, okay, I would really like this to change. And I think that this is an ongoing thing for just about anybody. This isn't just an ADHD specific thing or anything like that. Just to recognize, what are the times when I've just gotten mad and I can look back on and realize that I was probably wrong, or there wasn't really a need to get that mad in that situation, which is often when we're feeling hungry or exhausted or whatever it is. But also, what are those times when something needed to be said? It wasn't necessarily the best time to say it in that moment, but we still need to make some kind of compromise to bring it up in a positive way. So there are times of feeling like, when you feel like something is unfair or what have you, which we can put down to like anger inside, that you feel guilty about that, or you've, been indicated that's bad to feel, or that it just kind of brings down everybody. And then you might kind of press it down to the point that you don't actually let what you need to let heard. It's kind of like, okay, so I'll just internalize it and deal with it and kind of like pretend like everything's okay. But if you haven't brought forward and found some compromise of what it feels like you need, then that's going to come out in some way eventually. How do we recognize the difference between this is just something that I feel which isn't actually really useful, or I won't necessarily even feel that in a couple of hours, versus this is something that I feel right now and I might not express it well right now. It might be a better time later, but it is that I need to express. And that'll come up with parents as well. If there are kind of different parenting styles, one might be kind of the good guy and one might be the disciplinarian kind of thing. And it might feel like that's a bad role to take. But generally speaking, if it's not both people doing the disciplinarian role, somebody needs to still. And I don't know exactly, of course, what the specific things are that come up, but some of them, the things that tend to come out later, would be things that need to be discussed and come to a compromise about. So we don't want to see it all as like, I'm angry, so therefore it's bad and I should just shut myself away either. Like sometimes we can look back after a couple of hours and just be like, yeah, what I was mad about, I'm not really mad about anymore, more situational. But then when it's not that, to be like, okay, so what is it that I need to put on the table? And how can I put it on the table, so to speak, like with your family or what have you, in a way that is going to get you somewhere? What can you agree upon? If it's something about the kids that you might do differently, then to think like, okay, is there a way that we can come to some kind of agreement where whatever it was that led to the frustration doesn't continually happen? Because it won't just be a favor to you guys as parents, it'll be a favor to your kids as well. I remember, I think it was Jordan Peterson, who I saw in a video, who I happened to play a video of in the last couple of weeks, who kind of put it as, regarding being a psychologist and talking to parents, that was that, like, say in shopping centers and like anywhere where your young kids perhaps are going to be seen by other adults, the way that they get looked at, the way that they kind of get perceived, and they can see that by other adults, is going to depend on how they act. And if we allow our kids to be kind of like, we kind of can all kind of stand in a shopping center for a bit and see that when some kids are really mucking up and stuff, that other adults tend to like, maybe avoid eye contact with them or look at their parents with a bit of a look or whatever it is. That kind of thing impacts the self-esteem of kids. And if we can set up boundaries that are tight enough so that they end up having mostly positive interactions with other adults, that's going to substantially define them as feeling confident with other adults. Kids are extremely perceptive when it comes to emotions. They may not be able to, put words to it like we would, like they can when they're older, but they feel it in a more significant way, I think, than most kind of adults do. They can kind of brush it off as, water off a duck's back, but kids are looking around and feeling out the situation socially, emotionally. can be very perceptive to when somebody's not being truthful about how they feel or how somebody really perceives them to some degree. And often at times it won't be like another adult saying something, because that might be outside of the social, what they would be willing to do, but they might just like avoid eye contact or just kind of like sigh or something like that as they're going by. And you imagine like hundreds of experiences of that versus hundreds of experiences of like, oh, such a nice kid, and that is going to impact the way that kids feel about how they sit in the world. I guess like harsh things that I've said but had to say, when it comes to parents of clients that I've had where they've intentionally where they've kind of felt that it's like, I don't want to be the bad guy, I don't want to do this. And it's like, well, when you realize how high the stakes are of how good it can be to do that kind of discipline, then it's like, well, it's definitely worth it, Okay, so let's jump into this week, guys. So first, I just have a 5-minute video for you because I think that Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist and a well-renowned researcher in a few areas regarding moral psychology. He's also just very articulate and a good speaker, and I think that he gives a good impression in short form of what we'll go into detail of today.
So the first principle is intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. So there's a long idea in Western philosophy that the mind is divided. This is one of the great truths. My previous book was called The Happiness Hypothesis. It's about 10 great ideas that you find around the world. So the idea that the mind is divided into parts, which sometimes conflict, every civilization has noticed that. In the West, the way the parts have traditionally been put together, and you see this in Plato most clearly, is that the soul is divided into parts like a charioteer, reason, trying to control the two horses of the passions, the noble passions and the baser passions. And if a man studies philosophy and can strengthen the charioteer, can strengthen reason, he can get a grip on these horses. You need the horses to pull the chariot, but they're kind of dumb, and the charioteer has to provide all the guidance. And if a man can strengthen his mind, study philosophy, control those horses, then after he dies, his soul he'll escape the bondage of reincarnation on this degraded world, and it will go back with the gods whence the soul came. If he fails to control his passions, he will be reborn as a woman. So that's what the Greeks, so that's the way the Greeks thought about passion and reason. And that's the dominant view in philosophy, but there are occasionally counter voices. And David Hume is my favorite philosopher. He was a counter voice to this worship of rationalism. One of his most famous quotes from the Treatise on Human Nature is, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can pretend to no other office than to serve and obey them." So Hume said that the passions, the sentiments, these things come first, and they drive reasoning forward. Reason is a servant. We send reason out to find evidence for the conclusion we want, bring it back, and then we're done. As a psychologist, I've come to believe that Hume got it exactly right and Plato got it exactly wrong. I'll read a short section from the book, which I hope makes this clear. This is a section from chapter 4 titled "Reasoning and Google Can Take You Wherever You Want to Go." When my son Max was 3 years old, I discovered that he was allergic to must. When I would tell him that he must get dressed so that we can go to school, and he loved to go to school, but if I said you must get dressed, he'd say, I don't want to. He'd whine, he'd be difficult. The word must is a little verbal handcuff. If you tell someone they must do something, they want to pull free. The word can is so much nicer. Can you get dressed so that we can go to school? To be certain that these two words really had these opposite effects, one day I tried a little experiment. After dinner one night, I said, in a very even voice, just, Max, you must eat ice cream now. And he said, I don't want to. And then right away, I said, Max, you can have ice cream if you want. I want some. Okay, now this works with a 3-year-old. I've had friends say they tried it with a 5-year-old. They're too smart, but a 3-year-old, it works. The difference between can and must is the key to understanding all the weird things people believe, all the weird, terrible ways we use reasoning. And I get this idea from the psychologist Tom Gilovich at Cornell, who studies the mechanisms of strange belief. He studied why do people believe in UFOs and quack medical treatments? Why are these so hard to eradicate? And his simple formulation is that when we want to believe something, we ask ourselves, can I believe it? Can I believe it? Do I have permission to believe it? What that means is we use our reasoning to go out and search for evidence. Suppose I want to believe that Obama was born in a foreign country, that it was the birth certificate. I'm a Republican. I don't like Obama. I want to believe that there's a conspiracy going on. Can I believe it? All I need to do is type it into Google, and I'll get hundreds of millions of pages providing me evidence and preparing me for the rebuttals. Oh yeah, sure, they show that thing they show his birth certificate on the internet, but a doctor in Indonesia has testified. I'm just making this up, but it's there. I guarantee you somewhere you'll find stuff like that. So the internet is a great enabler of can I believe it? You can believe anything. Just Google it. You'll find evidence. Conversely, if you don't want to believe it, you say, must I believe it? And then you search for an escape hatch, a key to open the handcuffs.
Okay, so, that was largely related to how people make their beliefs and how people kind of form their ideas about the world. It also comes down to, well, we've got this emotional drive, and it may not be in line with what we want, but what our version of the world is as well. So, Pomodoro time. Uncovering more of what drives us. We've covered being aware of our thoughts through mindfulness and questioning if our automatic thoughts are accurate. These thoughts that just pop into our head at any moment, and realizing that they're kind of momentary opinions that we have that depend largely on our mood. We've discussed how thoughts can be accurate and yet be unhelpful, like in times where we're, angry about something that's happened and we feel that we've been wronged, which may not be untrue, but to continually think of is unhelpful. Today we reflect and expand on the recognition that we act on desires that we have not put into words or decided to act on. So what can we further understand about our emotional drives? Our past experiences form the basis for our reactions now, because our past experiences form our model of the world, our view of what happens in the world. And that is going to deeply integrate with the way that we perceive what happens as we go on. So failure. So we experience quote unquote failure when people look down on our achievements or not doing better. And enough experience of failure can make us stop trying new things or try things, quote unquote, without believing we can do them, reaffirming our prediction that we will fail because we don't set ourselves up for ultimate success. And just a reminder of this slide, if you just tried as hard as other kids, like these types of experiences that, by the way, it's important to point out, can happen really early in life before we have the kind of rational filter to see what things may mean when they seem like they mean something else. But if we get these kind of ideas about the world in early enough, then they can deeply impact the way that we see ourselves in the world and we deal with new experiences. It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if we believe that we're going to fail. At the same time, though, it doesn't need to feel like you've failed if you've just not adhered to it perfectly, especially if you're kind of getting better at it. Then you've got to recognize what that progress is, even though you might see like any kind of given point, even after progress, as being like, well, I'm still failing. Be like, well, I'm heading in the direction where I'm going to not be failing in the future. We've got to do that for ourselves as well. Like, even with kids, when they have like tantrums, if there aren't situations where they have no tantrums, then we should reward a lesser tantrum and specifically tell them how that was better. And given that that is the way that is most likely to work with anybody, we should have that same kind of view with ourselves of like, am I doing better than last week or last month? Because that's success relatively, and it'll end up getting you to a place where you're more happy with it, rather than being like, if it's all the same, then what's the advantage of getting better? So how to circumvent these issues? So don't set yourself up to fail. These things might be easier said than done. We've got to kind of think it through. But if we've realized settings in which we've maybe put ourselves into it, but we don't believe that we're actually going to succeed deep down, people might sign up to a university or a TAFE course, and they're thinking that they're not going to make it all the way through in the way that they want to. So then they don't prepare as much as they could, or they don't do this, or they don't do that, because then when they ultimately get to that point that they believe is inevitable where they're going to fail, then they can be like, well, yeah, but I only failed because I didn't do this or I didn't do that. So then they feel like it's not going to like completely drill into them as a failure. It still lands as a failure in the way that we reflect on it. So we want to, with anything that we go and do, to be like, what can I do that is going to make me as likely as possible to succeed? I don't want to kind of have anything left in the bank that I can point to and be like, well, this is why I didn't succeed. I want to get to the point, be like, I know that I have tried my very best. Because regardless of whether we've succeeded, I would say that that is a very admirable thing to have done. And if we happen to have that perspective, we'll maximize our chances of doing well. So related also to training to be less impulsive, think through new situations all the way. Imagine new situations are experiments. Is this plan likely to work with your resources right now? So like, if I were to be like, yes, I'll do this and I'll do this and I'll do this, this could relate to people pleasing, for example. I'll do this for you and I'll do this for you and I'll do this for you. And if we sign up to enough of those things, thinking like, well, I've just got to smash it all out, whatever the idea is, we've got to look at those things that we're agreeing to and be like, is the most likely thing that I'm going to get to the end of this and have achieved it? And to rein things in or change things in whatever way we need so that the answer is yes to that. So remember that failure is a totally essential part of achieving a big goal. We're not always going to be perfect with what we do. And if we haven't done something before that seems, big or grand or whatever it is, there will probably be people that doubt that we're going to get there. We will need to fight against the grain to some degree, but still to come up with plans that we believe are going to lead us to the best chance of success. And when we're reflecting on it, to use curious mind, like with your goals, to look back at things and be like, okay, so I tried this, and these were the circumstances around which I tried it. How did it go? How could I change those settings up so that I'm more likely to achieve it next time? In that kind of distanted approach of like, I'm just curious as an experimenter looking back at this experiment that I just put on myself. How could I change things around so it goes better without the assumption that I won't be able to? What about this experiment did not yield total success? And remember the failure dichotomy from goal maintaining, where we might get caught into the notion that, if we have maybe achieved 95% of what we wanted, then it still doesn't feel like that we've succeeded at all because it's some deviation from total success. And so we feel like that's a failure. We have to also, praise ourselves on these successions toward total success, and to realize that if we've achieved some degree of what we were going to do, that is not a failure. It's a partial success. And that can lead us toward getting more and more and potentially total success. Did you get closer than before? Did you achieve some of what you set out to do? These are the types of questions that we can ask ourselves. The feeling of not being good enough. So just like the notion of I'm a failure, we could think of ourselves as like, I'm not good enough in some way. If we develop a theme of never feeling fully validated by others, we can end up forming the idea that we're not good enough as we are, that we need to do something extra to just be enough. The belief that we are not good enough often leads to overcompensation, and that could be through people pleasing or trying to be unrealistically good in some area, which can lead to unrelenting standards, as we'll talk about as we go through. It's really important to recognize, I think that this is a fairly common one, probably for people in general, but certainly for people with ADHD, to feel that they, as they are, if you take somebody with ADHD whose parents, for example, primarily reward them for when they've done well academically or done well in some area, and then they feel like they're not getting that praise a lot of the time, but only under certain circumstances. So only when they excel at, maybe they excel at mathematics, or maybe they excel at sports, or they excel at music or something like that. If they're praised in a certain area, then they might feel that that is something about them that they have to put forward in order to be seen as enough. And this will often lead to results that we don't necessarily want, even if they're things that we might want to lean toward. So I've talked in the past about how I would have some inconsistency throughout school and stuff like that, but generally speaking, did very well academically, particularly in maths and science. And because I was kind of like given praise or what have you around those things, I formed this notion that that was something that I needed to put forward about myself in order to be validated or even like liked by other people. And that's what would lead to like trying to find ways of seeming smart or putting forward that I'm smart, even when meeting new people, which was not an ideal thing to do. Didn't lead to the best circumstances, but that's one example of what people could do. I've certainly seen situations or, had clients with the situations where they've been really good at athletics or really good at various different things that have ended up being the thing that they're praised for. And therefore they lean into that to such extent that they feel that that is necessary, because they don't try social interaction or life or what have you without doing those things. And people pleasing comes into the same category. Okay, so stepping out of people pleasing. Behind people pleasing tends to lie a fear that people will go away if we stop. That, they won't desire to be friends with us, desire to be around us anymore, because that's the thing that they were wanting to be around. So it feels like a real risk in stepping away from us, from that behavior. And unfortunately, providing things for people teaches them to seek us for things that they want. And that can be highly validating for us. The thing is, if they're trained into that, I've certainly had plenty of clients who I've worked through people pleasing to the point that they decrease it, and then they might experience from their family or friends or what have you, people in their life, that they're like, what's happened all of a sudden? Like, why don't they just like do this when they ask for it, kind of thing, even when it's inconvenient? So it can take some readjustment because that's what they expect from us. Sometimes people can get caught into like, well, if they don't like me for me, then I'm just going to reject them. And that's generally not the answer either. It's just that that's what they've been trained for. We need to show them a value of ourselves that is not based on us going out of our bounds of what we can continually do to do something for them, what have you. So the answer is not to reject everybody. The answer is to start providing people you care about with the kind of things for which you want them to value you, because that's what people will be trained to. People will get used to expecting from us what we give. And so I can think of a client who I went through that kind of thing in detail with, and for him, it was, he was quite successful in his career and whatnot. He had quite a lot of money compared with some of his family and stuff like that, and became the guy who, if they needed something in that fashion, they would ask for it. But it was always asking for something from him. And he felt like he wasn't valued as a person by them because they weren't seeking him out at good times and bad times, and they were only seeking him out in situations where they needed something. So then we drilled down and figured out what are those things that would make you feel that you're part of that group, part of their life in a real kind of way if they were seeking from you. And like these were things that he could reach out and do. But times when they're having good times, having hard times, whatever it is, to reach out and to give your time, to give advice or whatever it is, that is not something that they would get from you, but something that they value you as a person for giving. And these will differ based on people's personal relationships. But if people pleasing is something that you've felt like you've done, then it's worth kind of thinking like, well, what would make me feel valued as a person if they sought me out for? And how could I provide that? So figuring out what that is could be a challenge, but you've got this, like this is something that we can do. It also doesn't mean you stop being generous to people, but consider what you can do and trust that people who care about you will not leave you if you stop doing so much for them, especially if doing so much for them makes you feel like you're just somebody who they seek for stuff. Adjusting unrelenting standards. So unrelenting standards, like we can call this perfectionism, or, just feeling that what we put out there, whether it's work or what have you, that has to be at a standard that's so high that it's not necessarily even meetable. Behind unrelenting standards tends to be a fear that we will fail, if we lower our standards even a fraction, that we have to keep up that very standard in order to just be enough. Oftentimes, if we're trying to put out more than we can, we will put out less. That's why I have that martial arts as comparison. It also applies to sprinting. If we're like trying to run faster than we reasonably can, we will, generally speaking, run slower. We will be more tense, we'll be more kind of rigid, and we'll run slower. The martial arts comparison specifically, like if you're doing a hit, a strike, and if the idea is like, I need to punch like as hard as I possibly can, then that will be a slower hit than it would if we were just kind of thinking, I'm going to do exactly what I'm going to do, because we will end up with generalized effort. Well, like, a punch requires this to be activated, and not to have this activated or this activated, right? So that we can go forward. But if we're like, I have to do even more than I can, everything gets activated, and it actually slows down the corresponding motion. It's a different kind of thing that's going to stop us from doing as well as we can when it comes to, like, say, written work or academic work, but we will do less than we could if we were just thinking, I'm going to do as well as I can versus I have to do so well that I don't even know if I can. Where we might get caught up in extra time changing things around that don't even really matter to the overall piece, or this kind of excessive editing, or we might get stuck on the blank page and kind of be like, I don't know how to perfectly write this the way that I'd like to, rather than just being like, I'll write what comes to mind and then I'll kind of edit it afterward. We will get slowed down to some point. It will take our mind off other things, and our overall output for everything that we do overall will be less, because we feel that it's not enough when we're just doing what we can. So consider that we perform best when not under too much stress. So we tend to do better when we aim for an achievable standard. Also, processes of refinement like essays and emails can always be changed more, and not always for better results. And then I coach clients of mine to aim for this is a subjective point, but 95% of their usual standard to build a habit of stopping that. One way that I'd get people to do this, say if it comes to like, I don't know, emails, essays, or some written document that you have to submit, is if the concern is too high for actually submitting it at an earlier stage, but you feel like this applies to you, then one thing that you could do is when you feel like, say you're writing an email or one of those things, and you get to the point where you're like, I probably could submit it right now. It's probably fine. I'm going to save it, and it'll save with the time that you saved it and stuff like that. And then just continue on like you would. And then basically to look at, right, so this is a point where I saved it, reread that at the end of it and read the final copy and look at the time difference and be like, okay, so does the difference make it worth that extra time? Because oftentimes that it won't even necessarily get better in some objective way that somebody else will notice, but the amount of time might double, it will be significantly longer. So that realization will help us to be like, well, maybe I'll submit it a bit earlier, and to get more and more used to trusting ourselves, basically, that something is ready. So the result is lots of time saved and little to no decrease in true output standard, in my experience when I've done that with people. Sometimes we'll get into the pattern of really putting in too much time, or really putting in more time than it requires, because we just want to be absolutely certain that it will be good enough, where oftentimes that good enough point that we've reached our standard of what we can do is actually much earlier than we think it is. And this just kind of gives us the tools, I guess, to try that out. Be like, is there an earlier point here where I've actually achieved the standard, or pretty much achieved the standard, and it's taken me far less time? Pomodoro time. So rejection. We experience rejection when we open ourselves up to seek acceptance or affection from other people and are denied. And enough rejection can make us either stop asking or get really nervous when we ask, anticipating rejection and even preemptively rejecting others just in case. Got that kind of meme picture there. LeBron can't leave you if you leave him first. Like if it's like the fear that somebody might leave you, then we might push them away because then we don't feel as vulnerable to their rejection. Attachment styles. So when we kind of get caught up, I'll go to the second line first, the anxious avoidant style. So I'm fine alone, just don't ask too much of me and we'll be fine. Like if people have a parental setting growing up where they're not necessarily given a whole lot of, affection and warmness from their parents, and they're primarily praised when they've achieved something, then they can seem like quite a calm, kind of happy kid where they spend a lot of time by themselves and appear very, self-resilient. But when it comes to kind of that going forward and trusting relationships, their standard is like, well, I shouldn't trust that other people are going to be there for me. I need to be able to, stand on my own 2 feet. So in relationships, they might spend time alone, or they might be in relationships where they're perhaps even like kind of fulfilling the obligations that they see to their partner. But when it comes to them when it comes to them not having ideal circumstances in their life, then they won't want to lean on somebody else. Because if we lean on somebody else, then there's a fear, there's a risk that if they were to disappear all of a sudden, if they can't be relied upon, then we're screwed, right? And in the same vein, the anxious ambivalent is often when we have a parental setting where they're intermittently there. And this can be because our parents are preoccupied with other stuff. Maybe there's alcohol or other drugs involved, or grieving, or something that means that sometimes they're fully engaged and with us and paying attention to us, and other times they're not. As young kids, We will want to be watched because we don't know what's safe in the world yet. We need our parents to be like, yep, that's all good. And, oh, no, don't do that, right? We don't know what's safe. We need a parent to watch us. This is an instinctive thing. So it's always like, watch me, and feeling rejected when they're not. So then it's like sometimes feeling like things are all good, sometimes feeling like things are like we're being rejected. And if that's what we grow up with our relationships, then we can kind of want to potentially fall for people more quickly than average, potentially get into intense relationships. But when it feels like they pull away, even when it's ambiguous, even when they're probably not, then we might perceive it as such, and we might push them away because we don't want to feel rejected. We want to be the first movers. And of course, that will lead in just as much instability in a relationship. So secure attachment is relationships are intuited better, but anyone can form secure relationships with either attachment style, and everyone acts with anxious ambivalent style or anxious avoidance style at some times. So if you hear one of those prior styles and be like, oh, that sounds like me, that doesn't mean that you can't have a secure functioning relationship. It just might mean that it takes a bit more thinking through. So the key message is know the pitfalls and your propensities, and we can train out of the ones that are problematic for stable relationships. If it's something that you feel like applies to you and you want to know more, try checking out a book called Relationship RX by Stan Tatkin. Stan Tatkin is a world-renowned couples therapist. He's from the US. I've actually seen him present a workshop for one of the ACRA conferences. The best couples therapist, to my view, that I've ever come across, videos or in person or what have you. Really knows his stuff, and in his books really presents it in a way that makes a lot of sense. Relationship RX is just available as an audio book because he actually has actors play out the mock fights that will then get kind of iterated upon throughout the book. Definitely worth a look if you feel like any of this applies to you on this slide. All right, so if I know and have tried but just can't seem to change my patterns, so help is still out there. In that case, so we've been discussing core beliefs, and they can be compensated for or shifted over time. We discussed compensating through awareness and shifting it, and that's one of the ways that can help us to shift it over time by experimenting and seeing that things aren't quite that way. And that's kind of the CBT variant of making changes in that view. So to build a mutually exclusive belief by recording evidence for it. If the idea is, I'm a failure, or like, I'm inevitably going to fail if I do da-da-da-da, then to be like, what is it that I can believe about myself that is reasonable and opposes that in some way? Like, I can achieve under, if I do this or da-da-da-da. And then to build that view up by setting ourselves up to have experiences that show that that's true and reinforce it. Now, note, by compensating for dysfunctional patterns, you end up being exposed to contrary evidence, which is kind of part and parcel with that view. Experimental treatments or processed memories related to core beliefs, this can be really important if we've had traumatic experiences, particularly early on in life, particularly as kids, where we didn't necessarily have the kind of filter that we have as an adult to see how the same thing could mean different things, basically. Like, if somebody were to look down on us as an adult and be like, you're just no good, or whatever it is that the view is, then we could see that as like what's going through their mind, what are their agendas, what does that actually mean about me? What have they perceived about me? What do they know about me? All that kind of stuff that can come into how we see what that actually means. Whereas that as a kid, if we have that implied notion that we might very well just believe that, for example, that we're the failure, that there's something inherently wrong with us that is going to mean that we're going to fail. which is very unlikely to be a valid belief, right? And we should test that out. And we can look at that as an adult, but if we've had experiences that kind of got reinforced when we were younger that all seem to lead to that, and that's kind of like, that's where our mind goes on an emotional level when we feel that way, then it can be useful to see a psychologist who is skilled at something like EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or imagery rescripting, or another what we would call experiential type therapy. Those are the two that I happen to have been trained in, but there are various other forms. I mean, psychodynamic psychotherapy, going back to, the Freud and Jung and stuff like that, this is a way of getting into some of those deeper beliefs as well. It just takes a really long time. But there are ways to get into these deeper things and to address any kind of traumatic experiences that seem to have deeply changed the way that we see things in that regard. The result is no further disproportional reactions to related stimuli when that therapy has been conducted properly.